All right, good afternoon, church family. Alex and I are here at the church, and we are going to have our weekly Daytimers Bible study. We are socially distanced from one another presently.
Yep.
That's one reason why we're doing this in audio form, because if we did it in video form, you'd only be able to see one or the other speaking at a distance, which would be very strange. So we just thought we'd put the microphone between us and do it that way. So that's the plan. Well, we're in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, and we are going to be starting in verse 12. And I think you're going to find that this passage has a lot to do with our situation now. And there is going to be a little bit of humor at the end because, Alex, why don't you read 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 26?
26, all right.
Yep.
Greet all brethren with a holy kiss. I am not kissing you, Josh.
Okay, so fine. The humor is at the beginning. And we're not saying disobey Scripture. We're saying let's delay this a bit, okay? Just put it off a teeny bit. It's okay. We'll come back to it someday. I think actually when this is all over and we can assemble again, I really think everybody's going to be so excited you might even see a few holy kisses. So it could happen. So
be a great day.
Right. So anyway, just a little humor for you there, but I couldn't help but laugh when I read that earlier. Good times. All right. Well, Alex, why don't we get started? Would you read verses 12 and 13?
All right. But we request of you, brethren, that you appreciate those who diligently labor among you, and have charge over you in the Lord, and give you instruction, and that you esteem them very highly in love because of their work. Live in peace with one another.
All right. Thank you, Alex. Now, verses 12 and 13, when you're a preacher or a teacher and you go through the Bible book by book, chapter by chapter, verse by verse, which is what we do here at Callio Christian Church the vast majority of the time, you get to a passage like this and it sounds a little self-congratulatory, because it says, but we request of you, brethren, that you appreciate us. Well, Alex and I want to say thank you. We feel appreciated.
Absolutely.
God is good. I have been here. I'm in my 10th year of service here. Wow. Alex, when did you start?
I've been coming here doing through the summer
right.
for over 3 years now.
Okay, over 3 years.
Working with youth a little over 2 years. So.
And we haven't felt like anybody's tried to chase us away.
Nope.
No, I can't tell you how awesome it is to be in a church where people get along.
Absolutely.
99.9% of the time, there's no issues, no problems, and never been aware of any major scandal or huge issue or anything like that. Of course, there's disagreements and, the occasional hurt feeling and all that, and we don't downplay any of it, but we deal with it. And we come out the other side still a family.
Oh, yeah.
So God's been good to our church. God's been good to us. And even during this strange time that none of us saw coming, really, I never thought I'd be sitting here at a Daytimers of 2 at any point in time.
Meal wasn't too good today.
Yeah, the meal was not too good today because there was no meal. And Alex actually thought about bringing food, but I'm not sure 2 guys should try. No.
I ate macaroni, so that was my lunch.
You know what's funny? My daughter made gluten-free macaroni, so that's what I had for lunch.
Wow.
All right. Oh, you got a newsletter? All right. Oh, okay.
Do we have to fold them?
And that's another thing, too, if you're not aware. At Daytimers, once a month, we fold the monthly newsletter. We email a lot of them now, but there's still a few dozen to fold every week, so we do that. Nope, not too bad. All right, so Alex, do you have anything else to say about verses 12 and 13?
Nope, I think you explained it good.
All right, one last thought at the end of verse 13. Live in peace with one another. Now, every time I read a passage like that says live in peace or love one another, encourage one another, I think it's important to understand that we only need that command when it's not easy.
Mm-hmm.
It's one thing to say, love your neighbor. It's another thing to do it when they hate you.
Yeah.
It's one thing to live at peace with other people when they don't want to live at peace with you or they're causing drama or problems in your life. It's one thing to encourage somebody else even when they can never say a nice thing to you.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I read passages like this, live in peace with one another, it reminds me that even if somebody comes at me, even if somebody doesn't like me, somebody who disagrees with me with malice, I still have an obligation to live at peace. And also, something I've been teaching my teenage kids is you never want to burn bridges.
Mm-hmm.
Never want to burn bridges. We've had, my wife and I in particular, and I'm going to let Alex here talk here in a second. My wife and I in particular have had times, and I think everybody's had these times, where people have ripped you off, treated you poorly, said bad things about you, tried to put you in a bad situation. And my wife and I together have learned to turn the other cheek, to try to love other people, to, as 1 Corinthians chapter 6 puts it, rather be wronged, because when you do those things, oftentimes people will come around eventually. And even if you never get a direct apology, suddenly they're so much nicer to you, and they're glad to be around you, and they don't cause you problems anymore. You can turn enemies into friends, I'd say about 80% of the time. And the other 20%, well, you leave them to the Lord. But there's no reason to hold grudges or hate one another or anything like that. There's not a single person on this planet I wish an ounce of ill will to.
Mm-hmm.
And that is extraordinarily important for maintaining peace with one another. All right, Alex, give us some commentary.
Well, thinking of peace, I just thought of a thing from Star Trek. It was actually you make peace with your enemies, not your friends. And so, just like you were saying earlier, you make peace with people that are kind of difficult to be around.
Right.
And really, that's what we're supposed to do here as Christians, because if we only were friends with Christians, well, we wouldn't be discipling or making new Christians.
Right.
And people of the world, sometimes they're difficult to be around, and if we can make peace with them, show Christ's love, then just maybe we'll be able to lead them to the Lord.
Yeah, exactly. One other thought is that there's lots of scriptures that say, don't sin in your anger, or be slow to be provoked. Well, again, that only matters if somebody's trying to provoke you.
Yeah.
If this is something I've had conversations with many young men with over time, because I think every young man goes through this, and I did too, and my teenage sons, and that is, you have to understand anger. The emotion itself is natural. Like, everybody gets angry. The only question is, what do you do with it?
Mm-hmm.
That's it. That's all there is.
Yeah.
You can feel one way and act another. And also, if you do sin in your anger, let me give you a scriptural tip. There are no excuses that justify it.
Mm-hmm.
None. I can't tell you how many times I've had somebody say, well, I wouldn't have done this, or I wouldn't have said that if this other person hadn't done such and such.
Oh, yeah.
That doesn't matter at all. With teenagers, and I'm still learning how to be the parent of a teenager, 3 teenagers at the same time, very different teenagers. But they've all had situations where friendships were strained or even broken. And a couple of times where they lashed out, where they acted in anger. And every single time that ends poorly.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, can anybody listening to this, or can you, Alex, think of a single time, because I can't, of when I lashed out in anger and that ended up being the right thing to do? I can't either.
Time.
Right. It seems to be anger in the vast majority of circumstances. I'm not going to say 100%, but in the vast majority of circumstances is something best left to God when it's expressed.
Mm-hmm. I know being in high school and different things, I was in football and different sports, and just being a testosterone teenager.
Right.
Guys like to show dominance, I guess. And I've seen a lot of people get in each other's faces, and it happened to me. And I've always never really had trouble with my anger. I've always been calm, and people want to be angry, let them be angry. And I've always been the calm in the storm, I guess. And
okay, I'm gonna play the devil's advocate here.
Okay. I was coming to something good, Josh. Now you're gonna make me feel bad.
You want to finish your thought?
All right. Well, I was just thinking that I've been angry at people in my mind when someone's mad at me or whatever, and say a cheap shot in football or something like that. Well, not acting upon that anger has allowed me to continue to be able to have a conversation with a person in the future instead of an enemy. That's just what I was going to.
Okay, sure. And I'm not disagreeing with what you're saying as much as I'm saying you can be calm in a storm 1,000 times. It's the one time you're not.
Oh, yeah.
That tends to really rock everybody's world. So much so that I've had to make sure I don't excuse my rare transgression of this just because I know somebody who's angry all the time. Like, I can't justify my occasional slip up in this area because I have been around or associated with somebody who didn't have control.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's so easy to be like, well, I only sinned one time, but that other person sinned 1,000.
Yeah.
Well, you know what?
One
It
time.
don't matter in the end.
Yeah.
You know, I can't, because if you do that, if you let your mind go to some place and say, well, I'm better than this person on any level, it will not be long at all before you can excuse anything based on that.
Mm-hmm.
It's, it's interesting how, and I'm speaking from my own experience here. I'm not picking on anybody in particular, that I at least know my own flesh. In that, the moment I give myself an excuse to sin, I've really opened up Pandora's box.
Mm-hmm.
There is no such thing as stopping there. It's kind of like dieting for me. If I allow myself to eat something I shouldn't, it won't be but hours later I do it again.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there's just got to be a wall in my mind that says no, no, no.
Yeah.
And that's just my personal experience with that. I do not have fantastic self-control, I'll admit. I have to constantly keep that in mind.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we all have our gifts and we all have our weaknesses. And so when I teach on self-control, for example, I always feel like somewhat of a hypocrite because it's a constant struggle for me.
Mm-hmm.
Any thoughts?
I mean, I think that's the start of every sin. Someone gets in their head saying, oh, I can get away with this, or I can do it just once, and a few weeks down the road, you're doing it all the time. Lying, stealing, pornography, whatever you want to name it. I think that's how it starts.
Mr. Reese back in Bible college used to say, what's your favorite sin? Do you know it?
Mm-hmm.
And then he said, if you want to know what your favorite sin is because you don't know what it is yet, ask yourself what stupid thing you do when you're stressed out.
Yeah.
What do you do that you shouldn't be doing, but the excuse is life's crazy and I need some relief.
Mm-hmm.
And you actually see that excuse all the time in the media.
Yeah.
And so that's a really good question to ask yourself. In fact, that kind of takes me to the Lord's Supper every week, communion. You know, that time of self-examination. You can develop sort of a series of quick questions, or at least one or two questions you would ask yourself during that time, because it's only a few minutes, but it's an opportunity for your whole world to stop, to focus on Jesus, and to ask, where have I gone wrong? Where could I do better? And that's between you and God. Like, I don't want anybody to tell me that necessarily.
Yeah.
I'm not a priest. Jesus is our high priest. But don't let that time go to waste.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's probably if you think about it, it's probably only 3 to 4 minutes of your life that you're not focused on 2 or 3 other things.
Yeah.
So if we don't take advantage of that, we're really missing out.
Absolutely. Absolutely right.
All right. Now, we've been speaking for 13 minutes and we're through 2 verses. Obviously, I'm leading this Bible study. So.
Yes.
Okay, our goal is to finish the chapter. So
Finish the chapter? Are you sure?
Well, yeah, it's the end of the book.
28 verses.
No. It's 14 verses. Alex is exaggerating.
Well, 28's an inverse. I can't do math.
You know, no. Okay. Now, this next verse is pretty heavy, so let's just do that by itself. Verse 14. Go ahead, Alex.
We urge you, brethren, admonish the unruly, encourage the faint-hearted, help the weak, be patient with everyone.
All right. I honestly think that the end of verse 13, live in peace with one another, is the beginning of this list, because it's like a bunch of short, pithy statements of things we should be doing.
Mm-hmm.
So keep in mind, your chapter and verse numbers in the Bible were defined by men, not by God.
Yep.
So sometimes I disagree with how the verses and the paragraphs are divided up, because if you actually look at Greek, there's no paragraphs or indentation. That's just not a thing. And so how men decide to break it up and put chapters and verses there is a purely man-made construction. So I can disagree with that. So I'm going to read the end of verse 13 with that. Live in peace with one another, and we urge you, brethren, admonish the unruly, and so forth. So admonish the unruly. I did a little Greek study before today's Bible study because the word admonish is not one we use much.
Not at all.
I don't like saying old-fashioned word, even though it is an old-fashioned word, because I don't like the idea that we wouldn't like something just because it's old-fashioned.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's a big mistake. When it comes to traditions, it's amazing how the Bible is starkly neutral. It has some good things to say about traditions. It has some bad things to say about traditions. And Jesus, too. He talks about tradition both in a good and a bad light. And so I don't like just putting old-fashioned or traditional things in a bad category. And I also don't like assuming that they're perfect.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's always something to consider. And obviously we have this word here, and it's in Scripture, so we need to work with it. Admonish the unruly. This is the word for encourage discipline. And that makes sense, because unruly, what do you think of?
Rowdy people.
Right, right. And being a former youth minister and sitting here with our youth minister, when you think of unruly, the first thing you think of is kids running around. And really, a lot of time, at least when I was a youth minister, the kids enjoyed unstructured play just as much or more than structured play. Yeah. Basically, you let them run around and throw balls everywhere, and they have a great time.
I was thinking the kid that throws the ball in my back when I'm not
right.
paying attention.
Oh, yeah.
And laugh about it. You can't help but laugh with them. But
one thing they don't teach you about youth ministry is that kids will throw things at you, and that is their way of expressing love.
It is.
I have been pelted with balls, with candy, with books, with, I mean, you name it. And you have to always take into consideration every time it happens what the context is behind it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if it's a mad kid, that's a bad thing.
Yeah.
But if it's a kid having fun and he throws a beach ball at the back of your head, you need to receive it with a sense of humor.
Absolutely.
You know, and that's the tricky thing about youth ministry is that maybe the kid who threw it was mad when he threw it, but by the time it hits your head, he's in a different mood. Like, yeah. Really? You know? Yeah. And that's just part of kids and teenagers. That's something that I am okay with. And you got to be.
Yeah.
You can't work with kids and teenagers and not know you're dealing with 115 emotions by the time you get done with a youth group lesson. Like, it's just the way it is.
Definitely so.
Right. So, admonish the unruly. What do you think, Alex? In youth ministry context, how do we encourage the unruly to be more disciplined? Because that sounds like a pretty tough thing to do. So what are some things that you've discovered at least help?
I discovered different games.
Okay.
Different games require them to follow certain rules. Maybe put them in charge of, like have a key role where they have to follow certain ways or something, but they have to learn that sometimes things aren't always fair. Like games aren't always fair. People cheat. Yeah, even though we're at church, people still cheat and different things like that. And they just have to learn, hey, there's a beginning and an end, a finish, and we're going to get through the game, get through life, get through the lesson, get through a lot of things. So just because something doesn't go the way you don't like it, well, you still have to get through it.
Right. Well, and one rule we've always had in youth group is if you purposely throw the ball at the ceiling or the wall, you're out for that game.
You're out, yep.
Yeah. And that is something that has actually upset some kids. Now, what's funny is I can't think of a single situation where the kid wasn't aware of the rule.
I mean, it's told at the very beginning.
Right.
So.
We talk about it constantly.
Oh, yeah.
So I don't really buy the line. And I can't even think of a time, at least in recent memory, where a parent accused me of not telling their kids the rules. Like, it's pretty obvious. Don't do that. And so sometimes the kids will then have to go sit out the game. And no kid likes to be singled out.
Nope.
Like, one of the things about being a kid or a teenager is you want to feel like you're part of the group. And so if you do something stupid that results in you being singled out, well, that's one of those times where there's a necessary, controlled amount of guilt and shame that encourages them not to do that again.
Yep.
I mean, there's no yelling or screaming. There's no meanness or anything. Just, oh, you got to sit out.
Yep.
You knew the rule.
Yep.
And I've actually seen some pretty upset kids.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
I'm not going to go into details, but we've had some situations where, let's just say, the reaction did not fit the crime.
Yeah.
But now the punishment did, but not the reaction. Yeah, but that's okay. So yeah, games, and that's something people don't think about is, and I read this quote a long time ago, and I thought it was really useful. The serious work of kids is play.
Mm-hmm.
If you can teach a kid how to play properly and fairly and still have fun while following the rules, involving everybody, having a good time, that spills over into life.
Mm-hmm.
But if your play is corrupted, if you are encouraged to cheat, or you get away with cheating constantly, or you constantly are getting away with the rules, well, do you think that's going to translate into real life?
It will translate.
Absolutely, it will. So I know sometimes when we talk about games in youth groups, like, oh, games, they actually do serve a purpose.
Absolutely.
Now, if you have a youth group that does nothing but play games, obviously that's a problem.
Yeah.
But I can't think of a single time where that's occurred. We always have.
We always have a lesson.
We always have a lesson.
Game and a snack too. They even get fed.
All right, yeah. And that's actually something I started a long time ago.
You started feeding them?
I started feeding them. And now I have a couple of rules. We don't ever have soda.
Yeah.
We don't give them sugar.
Mm-hmm.
So what we feed them is whatever we feed them plus water. And also, a lot of the times the kids help cook and learn how to do some basic culinary stuff. And they like that.
Mm-hmm.
They have a good time with it. So I'm a big fan of that. And obviously I am the product of it.
When we cook and have pancakes or whatever, there's always dishes to clean.
Yes.
No one wants to do dishes, but that's part of the treat.
And you know what? Right there. So think about it. They get a snack, but they had to cook it and they have to clean up.
Mm-hmm.
So all of that encourages discipline.
Yeah, you gotta work for it.
Admonishing the unruly. You can get really creative with this, and you can really make it happen without just a top-down authoritarian sort of style.
Mm-hmm.
You can always tell when an adult wants to help with youth, but they have no idea what to do.
Yeah.
So they just start shouting commands.
Yeah, that doesn't
And it's
help.
like, hey, you know what? Go ahead and try.
Yeah.
I mean, you're in charge.
Mm-hmm.
You can approach it that way if you want. Let me know how it goes for you.
Yeah.
I'm just going to sit here in the background and you just go ahead and whip those kids into shape.
Uh-huh.
Right.
I was with a group of, I guess it's high school camp or junior high camp, one of the two. Either one, they're both rowdy kids, and I was with a camp team, and there's a girl that thought she could like be authoritative and yell at the kids or whatever, and I just sat in the back, and she's like, these kids just don't want to listen. They just want to keep on talking and everything, and I was like, yeah, you just yell at them the whole time. So the way I found to discourage that is the ones that like to talk. I was like, hey, which one of you two are faster? And so I had them race each other around the whole camp. They
There you
thought
go.
it was so fun.
Yeah.
It was just exerting their energy.
Right.
Guess what? After a couple of days, they were tired.
They were
didn't
tired.
talk much.
Right. Well, and that's just it. I had another Sunday school teacher who, this was, I think, for 5th and 6th graders. She would give them like Bible coloring sheets. And as long as they didn't talk while she was teaching, they could color the sheets while she taught them.
Mm-hmm.
And then she would ask them questions, and it was amazing their recall.
Really?
And it's because by focusing your mind on the coloring sheet and listening, suddenly all the other distractions were gone.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't talking to one another. They weren't thinking about other things.
Hmm.
And so it was really effective for them. I mean, I don't, when a teacher says something works over time, well, they're the expert.
Yeah, might have to try that for junior worship.
In fact, what I used to do at junior worship is I would give the kids activity sheets and then I'd read to them.
Oh, yeah?
And that was a big hit
Mm-hmm.
because they really liked the story and also something to do.
Yeah.
And that was before we had the FLC, so we couldn't run around.
Mm-hmm.
So,
They like to run around.
Right.
They
So
love that.
But, you could rotate or whatever,
Yeah, there's a healthy amount.
Right, there is. And it works.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't want to belabor this point forever, but admonishing the unruly. I think sometimes when you hear the word admonish, you just think, boy, you better shape up. But the word is encourage discipline.
Mm-hmm.
I've rarely been in a situation, myself included, where somebody was yelling and screaming at me and that was encouraging me to change my behavior. Almost always in that situation, if you do what they say, you're just trying to stop the yelling and screaming. Like, there's actually no real heart change in behavior or lessons learned. It's just, I'm just going to get away from this person as fast as possible. And if that means I'm going to temporarily stop what I'm doing, then fine.
Yeah.
But there's no encouragement there.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the scripture is wiser than that.
Yeah.
All right, let's move on. or we're never going to get through this.
Yeah, I keep on thinking of more examples.
I might cut it off at 45 minutes regardless. Encourage the faint-hearted. Now that's a whole other kind of thing.
Complete opposite.
Yeah, it is. Because the unruly, they have lots of energy. They usually have their own mind about things. But the faint-hearted, that makes me think of somebody depressed.
Mm-hmm.
And let me give you a story just from last week from me. I was in quarantine for 6 days awaiting the test results of somebody else, not myself. But I, want to be a good example as a leader, and I not only was home for 6 days, I was in the same 48 square foot for 6 days.
Mm-hmm.
Did everything there. And let me tell you something. That got a little depressing.
Sure.
Even with modern technology, like I've got my phone, I've got my computer, I had some things to do, I was able to do some Bible studies. I wasn't like socially isolated, but just being physically restrained like that
Mm-hmm.
for the first time in my life for 6 days. I've been visiting nursing homes and hospitals for years now on a regular basis. But the difference is I always get to leave.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them never do. Like never. Not after 6 days like me. Never.
Mm-hmm.
And I was looking at a maximum of 2 weeks. So I have to admit, I grew up a little bit.
Yeah.
It put some perspective in my mind that even during times where we don't have epidemics going on, even when the economy's good, even when everything else looks cheery, even when the weather is nice outside, for some people it doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
They're in the same place.
It's a humbling thought.
Oh man, it really weighed on me. So how would you encourage the faint-hearted?
See, I don't know if this goes along with the faint-hearted, but I think of also with youth at like camp, there's different talent shows, and maybe there's a person who's a good singer, and they're like, oh, I'm scared to go up on stage, and well, you're a good singer, you should go up and go on stage, do it, try it, and conquer your fear and everything. That's kind of what I thought of as encouraging them to step out of their comfort zone.
Okay.
So that's kind of what I thought was processing.
Yeah, that's kind of the same thing with the preacher boys.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, same thing. So I want to just go back to this idea of depression a little bit. I have, in a Sunday morning sermon, actually brought my bottle of antidepressants, and I've been on an antidepressant for a long time. It's a mild one, it's a minor one, but it takes the edge off.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a little bit of family history, nothing major, but a little bit of family history of depression in my family. And I fought it for years, like a lot of people do. And the reason why I fought it for years was because I kept wanting to believe there wasn't anything wrong with me. But then it struck me one day that I'll take ibuprofen if I have a headache or something. I'll take like an antibiotic if I get prescribed one by a doctor because I get sick.
Mm-hmm.
Where did we get the idea that every other part of our body can have something wrong with it but the brain?
Yeah.
That's silly.
Mm-hmm.
And we obviously don't have perfect bodies.
No.
Like we live in a fallen world. Sin has rent its effect all over creation, including us. And the fact that God has given us all these modern, amazing medical breakthroughs, like people will take blood pressure medicine and they'll take statins and they'll take other things, but they won't take an antidepressant.
Mm-hmm.
And again, what I'm on is mild, like it's like the second lowest dose you can get for an adult. And I don't believe it's a crutch. And the reason why I talk about it openly is because people need to see productive leaders in their societies admitting they're not perfect.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of the times, not all the time, but a lot of the times, you have leaders who are scared to death to expose their weaknesses.
Mm-hmm.
But it is the leaders, most of all, who need to do that. Like, I am very open about what I'm good at and what I'm not good at, because I want people to use me where I'm actually useful.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a computer problem, good chance I can help you out. You need surgery, do not call me.
Don't call Josh.
Yeah.
Don't call Alex either.
Right. And so again, I bring up this antidepressant thing, not to belabor a point, but just if you've been thinking about it or you've been resisting it or somebody else has, share this broadcast with them, this live stream with them. I don't remember what sermon it was that I did that. It was a year or two ago. And share this with them because it does not need to have any shame or guilt attached to it. No judgment attached to it. Maybe you find another solution. I'm not saying it's the only answer. But again, if you're willing to take something else a doctor prescribes to you and it helps you, and this will help you. And by the way, the antidepressant I'm on has been around for 30 or 40 years. There's virtually no side effects. It's been proven for a long period of time. It's old school at this point.
Mm-hmm.
And could I live without it? Yes. But would I choose to, especially for $4 a month? No.
Yeah.
No. And by the way, it's not doctor mandated. This is something I finally decided I was going to go ask for and just see if it helped.
Mm-hmm.
And you know what? It did take the edge off. You know what the number one thing it helped me do? Okay, I'm going to go back to my teenagers. When you have teenagers, even if you have good teenagers like I do, and I'm talking about kids that go to school and go to work and largely speaking stay out of jail, a little humor for you, they can still aggravate the snot out of you. I mean, you know, teenagers that'll wash like one sock, you know, or they'll
wash one sock. That gets you going.
Well, I mean, just, you know, a whole load of laundry and all the time and resources wasted on one sock. Or they'll pile up dishes in their room until you can smell it from a mile away. Or they'll walk over clothes they've had on the floor since the prehistoric era. You know, just stuff that as an adult you grew up out of, but what you forgot is that probably as a teenager you did one or more of those things.
Mm-hmm.
And so what this, you know, one of the things that I benefited from with this antidepressant was I didn't get so mad. Now, I still corrected them, we still dealt with the problem, and, you know, of course that's just part of parenting. But the difference was it didn't like bug me all day anymore. I was able to deal with it and let it go.
Yeah.
It took the edge off. Mm-hmm. And you know what? Thank God for that.
Well, that's a lot healthier for you and your family,
Heck
too.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh,
yeah, totally. We need to get this. Like, there's no stigma behind blood pressure medicine or statins or ibuprofen. Mm-hmm. Why do we still have a stigma about antidepressants? It is beyond me.
Yeah, I've thought that too. I don't know.
And I've never heard a good answer to it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I've even heard an answer to it recently.
Yeah. Like,
it's really just something that gets stuck in our head, whether it's pride or stigma or pressure or peer pressure or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But I've never heard a sound answer.
Me neither. I was thinking that in my head. Why is it in this culture like that?
Well, I think it's that way everywhere pretty much.
Yeah.
I mean, it's less so than it used to be.
Mm-hmm.
But, man, I'm thankful for it.
Yeah.
I am. And I think my family is too. And I would recommend it to anybody. And I'll never have an ounce of embarrassment or shame about sharing that. Mm-hmm. And I know probably there's some other people that don't want me to. But again, it's why? Because you want to see your leader as somebody who doesn't have struggles? Like, man, we're all people.
Absolutely.
Like, I tell you, I've been in leadership either intentionally or by accident, true story, by accident my entire adult life. And I have been in the public and private sector. I've been in church and business and nonprofits. And I can tell you right now, you want to know the strengths and weaknesses of your leadership.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You do.
Absolutely.
If you think that you could ever put somebody into leadership that doesn't have weaknesses, you are unintentionally making that person out to be God.
Yep.
And that's a fatal flaw.
Mm-hmm.
Because when things go wrong, you're like, well, I didn't see that coming.
Yeah.
Well, maybe it's because that person wasn't suited to that role.
Mm-hmm. That is right there.
You know, every 4 years we have an election in this country where there's a whole big bunch of people who think so-and-so is the next Messiah.
Yeah.
And the older I get, the more I think the next crazy person's running for office.
Mm-hmm.
Because you got to be crazy to want to be president.
No, thank you. Nothing.
In fact, the older I get, the less authority I want, the less in control I want. I don't know.
Less authority, fame, everything. I don't want any of that.
I mean, one time I was literally elected president of an organization as a joke. It happened. And it was a real organization. But nobody else would do it. And I didn't have any idea what I was doing. But it was something that needed done. So somebody who was a guest, who had never been there before, nominated me to be president. And everybody agreed. And I'm like, well, what does that mean? And for 3 years, I fumbled about. You know, oh boy. And I think one of the reasons why, when you actually do have some degree of authority, if you're any good at it at all, you suddenly realize that it's way more responsibility than it is decision making. It's far more dealing with it and carrying the burden and getting things done than it has to do with making a decision here or there. I mean, it's 99, or I'd say 98% responsibility and 2% authority. And what's funny is that nobody gets in your way when you take responsibility for something. But you'll have all kinds of resistance, those rare occasions you need to make a decision.
Oh, yeah.
But what's funny is that if you do authority right, you're taking responsibility for your decision, and you're willing to accept blame if you're wrong. And by the way, if you've been in leadership as long as I have, that is inevitable.
You gotta make mistakes.
It's going to happen. And again, going back to parenthood, man, I've made mistakes. Made mistakes with money, made mistakes with kids, made mistakes with marriage, everything. And yet, at any point in time, does God say, I give up my headship? That I can give up that authority? No, which means the responsibility, if anything, just grows and grows, and I have to do that.
Yeah.
It's nothing I can abdicate myself from. And I think that's what happens sometimes, is that you make a bad decision and you think, well, I shouldn't be in leadership. And so you abdicate your authority because you want less responsibility. And then you find out that things are somehow even worse.
Yeah.
Like, I've met some mediocre leaders who a lot of people wanted to replace, but it turns out their replacement was much worse.
Yep.
And that's not good. Like, I get the frustration, you know. And in church in particular, church leadership, you'll meet, you know, this is a good example, I think. A preacher's at a church 6, 7, 8, 10, 15 years, whatever it is. And inevitably, he's repeated some stories. Inevitably, you kind of get used to his style. Inevitably, you start wanting to hear something different. Well, the solution, preachers, if you're listening, if there's any preachers listening, the solution to that is make sure there's a variety of voices on stage. Don't be the only one talking.
Yeah.
Because you will inoculate your people against anything you have to say. And that's one reason why I've tried to have, you know, different worship leaders and different communion devotion givers, and even different people give the sermon throughout the year from time to time, because that kind of variety is super good for the congregation and for you. And you know, Alex, he preaches for me once a quarter, and he does daytimers at least once a quarter. And we have missionaries that come for Sunday school, and the preacher boys preach for me too. And I think last year, out of the 52 Sundays, I preached 40 times.
40.
So that's an 80-20 ratio. That's enough of a breakup where people don't get inoculated.
Yeah.
And that's good. It's really good. And any preacher who is so insecure that he feels like he constantly has to be in the pulpit will self-defeat.
Yeah.
That's how you make sure people get rid of you.
Yeah.
Hog the microphone.
Well, it's kind of like Saul and David. If you had someone that really knocked out the pulpit and people are like, wow, we should have him more often. Be like, yeah, great.
Go for it.
Found a good.
I've had people, you know, occasionally joke with me, like some preacher boy gives a fantastic sermon, or we even have a guest speaker give some fantastic sermon. Like, well, that person's putting your job at risk. And I said, I sure hope so.
Yeah.
I mean that. You know, in fact, one of the secrets about leadership is if you do it well enough, eventually you will work your way out of a job. If you have managed and led things properly, over time, you become less and less necessary. And a good leader knows that in advance and has a plan. He's never caught off guard by that reality. In fact, you know a healthy church when the preacher leaves and the church keeps going.
Yeah.
It doesn't fall apart. Because he, you know, according to Ephesians chapter 4, one of the jobs of the evangelist is to equip the church. Over time, he ought to have accomplished that purpose. And it should be in even better shape. And that's also why if a preacher leaves for a week or two for a vacation or to go preach somewhere else for a revival or something, everything just goes just fine.
Yep.
But boy, if the whole world falls apart every time you're gone,
That's
a bad sign that it depends on you too much. Yeah.
Yeah. Very grateful for the leaders who step up during summer when there's a Wednesday night youth group and people come in and I don't have any complaints when I
And
come
it's
back,
fine.
so it's great.
Yep.
So,
And
pretty
maybe
great.
everything doesn't go perfect.
Well, yeah,
Maybe there's a follow-up issue here or there. But the
Mhm.
difference is the whole system doesn't melt down.
absolutely.
And that's good leadership.
Mhm.
One last thought I'm going to have on this, and we're going on 45 minutes here, so we'll probably cut this off pretty shortly. So much for getting through the rest of the
That's what I'm
chapter.
saying.
This
Is
was a
that-
traditional Josh Bible study.
3 verses.
Yeah. Actually, I always quote this, okay, so if you've heard this before, forgive me. But I remember one of the ladies at Daytimers one time, I literally had a Bible study for 45 minutes on one half of one verse.
Mhm.
And that was Daniel chapter 1, verse 1. And that's because there's a lot of background material that goes with that verse. Like, it's important. It really is. And it was a good Bible study.
I remember that.
But I remember her saying, we're never going to get through this. And it did take us a year to get through Daniel.
It was a good study.
It was a good study.
It
We
was
had a good
thorough.
Right. And, all you can do is laugh at yourself. I can't tell you, I have these grand plans sometimes. I'm going to preach through this whole chapter.
Mhm. Yeah.
And I'll tell you something else as a preacher. And, Alex exercises this too. If things don't go according to plan, the number one person who should sacrifice their plan is the preacher.
Mhm.
If prayer requests go a little long in service, or there's a surprise music special, or you just can't preach through your whole sermon, you should still end on time.
Yep.
I'm talking 99.5% of the time, you should end on time.
Absolutely.
And if you do go over, boy, you better have the world's greatest reason. Because if you make any kind of regular habit out of it, people will not listen.
Mhm. I've learned teaching junior worship is kids have questions, and sometimes all of them have questions all at the same time. And I remember teaching on the triumphal entry, and there's a certain part where I really like to teach about Jesus coming in on a donkey as to a horse. A donkey is for peace, and a horse is for war. And I was about to that point. That's my favorite part. One of my favorite lessons to teach. Kid raises their hand, asks a question. It's a good question. We answer it. That caused another question, another question, another question. I was like, I could have been mad, aggravated, and didn't get to go
No.
through the lesson, but nope. I was like, you know what? That's good that they're
Yep.
able to talk, ask questions, and some of them were really hard questions too. I was
Oh,
like,
yeah.
man. Can I
The
see-
hardest questions come from like the 5 to 10 age group.
Yeah. Things I wouldn't expect at all. I was like, well, let's try to get through this.
A lot of teenage questions range from genuine curiosity to I'm trying to throw you off.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. But a lot of the 5 or 10-year-olds, like, they really want to know, but it's like an unanswerable thing, or it's vague, or it's speculation.
Yeah.
That can be tough.
Yeah. Yep. I
You know.
remember trying to explain what happens when we die. Do we go to heaven? What happens? Working through all that. What happens if you don't believe in Jesus? Well,
And to somebody listening, that may sound obvious. Well, yeah, if you're a Christian, you die and you go to heaven.
Mhm.
Technically paradise.
Paradise, I'd explain.
And that's not technically heaven.
Uh-huh.
It is where Jesus is.
Mhm.
And that's why Jesus tells the thief on the cross, today you will be with me in paradise.
Mhm.
But Hades is different than hell. We don't want to go into all that right now.
Nope.
But the point is, do you go into that kind of detail with kids?
Mhm.
And I think that would be a good Bible study for another time.
Absolutely.
We're not going to dive into that right now.
No.
All right. Well, I think that's actually a pretty good place to end. We're going on 44 or 45 minutes here. And the next section, or the next part of the verse, is help the weak, be patient with all men. That's a whole other
Mhm.
ball of wax. So we'll come back to that next week. Thank you for joining us. Appreciate it. We miss you all. At the same time, we're so grateful to have this technology, a gift of God, where we can still study the Word of God together and communicate via the computer, via the phone, text messages, emails, even through the mail. So there's been some of that.
Yeah.
Just don't lick your envelopes.
Yeah.
That's
Just don't.
that's the key there. And I've had people ask, well, I only have the kind of envelopes where you lick. Well, if you have tape, use tape.
Mhm.
That's another option. If you don't have tape, I'll mail you some tape
Yeah.
in a taped box. Or I'll drop it off at your house.
Yeah, that might be better.
Right. So all kinds of options there. Well, any closing thoughts, Alex?
Nope, I don't have any.
All right. Well, again, thanks for joining us, and we will talk to you later.
Yep. Bye, everybody.